Now, Sri Lanka's economy has been under siege, we could say, for the past 3 years, having faced what we could term a series of unfortunate incidents since the 2019 Easter Sunday attacks that dealt the country's main foreign exchange earner, the tourism industry, a serious blow. Events since then have not helped in the country's efforts to recover. Faced with a serious dearth of foreign exchange now and recent shortages in key commodities, questions remain as to the government's effectiveness in handling this crisis. With the government having recently floated the rupee and hints of possible International Monetary Fund assistance in the offing, it begs the question whether this will be sufficient. With that, we have with us Professor of Practice of International Development at Georgetown University, a former Chief Economist of the World Bank for South Asia region, Professor Shanta Devarajan, to help us figure out what our options are. A very warm welcome, good evening and good morning to you there.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
All right. Professor Devarajan, I think before we move on to discuss about what Sri Lanka is faced, now I'd like to understand what this really means for us, the IMF program. We talk about rollout, debt restructuring, we talk about an IMF program, but I don't think we here in Sri Lanka do really understand what it means to go into the IMF or to defer or have a bailout. What does it really mean? And for Sri Lanka, what's the best option now?
Okay, the starting point is that Sri Lanka has a very serious problem. In fact, it has two problems. One is the country has a liquidity problem. It doesn't have very much foreign exchange reserves. They're about $800 million of foreign exchange reserves, whereas imports are costing more and more. But the second, which is even more serious, is that Sri Lanka has an insolvency problem, that the debt is not sustainable. So that all of the analysis shows that the country at the current rate will not be able to pay back the debt over time. And that's why people are calling for a debt restructuring. And I want to be very clear that a debt restructuring is different from a debt default. And a debt restructuring involves beginning to negotiate with the creditors, all of the official and the private creditors, to reduce the level of debt to a point where Sri Lanka can actually pay it back. A default, by contrast, is one where the country just reaches a point where they can't pay anything. And that could be disastrous for the country. I mean, countries like Lebanon that actually experienced a default had their GDP fall by 20% and inflation reach over 100%. So we want to avoid that. But you also want to undertake a debt restructuring because the alternative, which is hoping that you can pay back the debt as it's currently required, will cause an undue hardship to the people. And we're seeing it on the streets right now. There's a shortage of fuels and pharmaceuticals and food, and prices are skyrocketing. You should not be paying back the creditors and starving the people at this point. So I think the debt restructuring is the orderly process by which you negotiate with the creditors. Now, where the IMF comes in is that in order to undertake this negotiation with the creditors, first Sri Lanka has to appoint a financial advisor. But most importantly, the IMF can do the analysis to see what is the debt that is sustainable for the country. And it's important to have an agency like the IMF do that analysis because they're credible. They're actually, their analysis is objective. So the IMF will do that analysis and present that to the creditors, and then they can help coordinate that negotiation with the creditors to see how much each person's debt can be reduced or postponed. It doesn't necessarily have to be reduced, it just gets postponed or rescheduled in such a way that Sri Lanka can come out of this very difficult situation on a more sustainable path.
Professor,
now, the second part of...
Yes, go on.
The second part of that is that in order to achieve that sustainable, a more sustainable debt, Sri Lanka has to undertake certain fiscal adjustments. Because right now, the revenue, it's collecting so little revenue from taxes that's one of the reasons why they can't pay back the debt. So they may have to raise tax revenues and also cut some subsidies and cut some other expenditures on the public budget that are draining the treasury. Now, those are steps that need to be taken in order to achieve a sustainable debt. The difference is with an IMF program, you undertake those steps. It also then opens up new sources of financing for the country from the IMF, but also from the World Bank. That'll open up the possibility that the World Bank can provide
now,
budget
Professor,
support
in your view, are we on track? Now, we understand the government was telling us that we're going for a homegrown solution, but as the crisis developed, we're now opening up. There are hints that we will work with the IMF. There's also the government showing us that they're ready to move into other restructuring plans for the economy. There's the all-party conference meeting up, and there's also an economic council with an advisory committee appointed to it. But again, floating the rupee to reaching out to the IMF. Are we on track? Are we on track to ensure that those policies that you were talking about will be achieved?
Well, those two things that you mentioned, floating the rupee and raising interest rates, by the way, are also part of that restructuring program. But the two things that are missing, but I think the government has at least started discussing at least one of them, which is this appointment of a financial advisor. That's very important, and all countries that have undertaken debt restructuring have started with that. And one point about the reason why there's an urgency is that just by appointing a financial advisor, that financial advisor can then negotiate a postponement of the interest payments on the debt that's coming due in the next 3 months, which could be an enormous relief when you have all these import bills to be paid. That instead of having to pay interest payments to the creditors, you can use it to buy necessary imports for the population. But the second is some signal that the country is going to undertake the fiscal reform, whether it's simply a question of raising the threshold on who has to pay VAT or who has to pay income tax, lowering the threshold, of who has to pay VAT or who has to pay income tax, can be an important step in that direction. And that's the kind of thing that gives confidence, not just to the IMF, but also to the creditors, that the country is serious about restructuring its debt.
Very quickly, Professor, from international investors to local exporters, as well as the general public, how do we set the kind of confidence? And again, in your expertise, is this a situation that we can come out of in the short term? And again, immediately, in the next few days, what must the government do?
Absolutely. I think it can be done, and it has been done. There are many countries that have undertaken debt restructuring. And just give you, Jamaica or Ecuador have done it recently. And the important thing is that having undertaken a debt restructuring with an IMF program, most of these countries were able to resume borrowing in capital markets in 6 to 9 months. So I would say that's the horizon that Sri Lanka can look towards if they start now. And they have started, as you said, with certain of the steps. But the two most important steps, I think, that need to be taken in the next 3 weeks is the appointment of a financial advisor and a change in the thresholds in some of the tax rates, the tax payments, the thresholds of eligibility, so that there will be an increase in fiscal revenues. With those two signals, I think when the finance minister, I think, is supposed to visit the IMF here in Washington in April, there's a good chance that then they can reach an agreement to start working on an IMF program and start pursuing this debt restructuring. And that would give tremendous relief to the current situation in the country. Then you might be able to afford many more imports and it'll relax some of these constraints and relieve some of the shortages that are going through in the country.
Thank you very much, Professor Devarajan. Indeed, it was a very fruitful and informative discussion. I look forward to talking to you at length. We had with us a Professor of the Practice of International Development at Georgetown University, Professor Shanta Devarajan, who is also a Chief Economist for South Asia of the World Bank.